Hello, everybody. I'm going to be reading chapter 7 and finish off Joanna. So, where I left you off was her and Janie really made quite a friendship. And Henry had just walked in and saw Joanna a bit cleaned up, wearing his wife's old apron. And yeah, here's how it starts. Joanna looked at Janie and Jeremy and then followed in Henry's angry footsteps. She found him savagely chopping wood in a corner of a barn. Savagely is one of your vocabulary words. Somehow I don't really think that this is what Mr. Brace had in mind, Joanna spat, not quite sure where her bravery was coming from. Who? He asked between heavy swings. Mr. Brace, the man who started the orphan trains. I don't think that adopting children out to moody, overworking farmers was what he had in mind. No, I suppose you're right, said Henry, with a heavy sigh setting the axe down. Joanna was taken surprise. She froze. She had expected an argument or worse. A not so small part of her wondered if Henry would hit her. He sat down on a stump of a log and looked at her seriously. Here's how I figure it. You got nothing and nobody. And all I got is this farm and a household that I can't manage by myself. We both wanted a whole and perfect family, but somehow ended up with each other and those 3 kids in there. So the way I see it, we got a couple of options. We can cut our losses, head our separate ways, and do our best on our own. Or you can accept my apology and we can start fresh together. What do you say? Henry folded his arms and looked at Joanna with thoughtful green eyes. Joanna stared at him and thought about his question for a long time. Henry almost stood up to go, thinking their relationship was a lost cause. Wait, Joanna said. I'll stay, if a few things change. All right, I'm listening. Well, for starters, we take turns with Johnny at night, Joanna said firmly. Well, that sounds fair. I'd like to add that you don't wear my wife's clothes either. We can get you some new ones next time we go to town instead, but from now on, even if Janie says it's okay, you leave them be. Joanna nodded and then continued. And from now on, I'll do the cooking? Deal, Henry laughed. Tentatively, another vocabulary word. Joanna stuck out her hand to seal the deal with a handshake. Henry walked toward her, put his arm around her shoulder, and steered her out of the barn and back to the house. You know, from the moment you shouted your name at me in that church, I knew you were meant to be part of this family, Henry told her as they walked to the house. Really, why? Joanna asked. My wife, she wanted all of our kids to have J names. Jeremy, Janie, Johnny, and now Joanna. Chapter 8. True to his word, Mr. Swan did come back 1 year later. The week prior to his arrival, he sent a letter to the town's pastor, who then told the congregation. That's another vocabulary word. On the day of his arrival, Joanna stood waiting for him on the train platform. She was excited to see him and tell him how her life had changed for the better. Joanna wasn't the only one looking forward to catching up with Mr. Swan. Several of the other orphans from last year's train ride were here to see him as well. Joanna waved to a few of them. She knew them better now that they went to school together. Joanna was so busy scanning the horizon for Mr. Swan's train that she didn't see a small girl sneak up beside her. Joanna looked down when she felt a tug on her skirt. Her eyes met Ruthie's, now familiar dark eyes, and smiled. Remember, Ruthie was the girl that got a piece of her bread when Joanna looked at her maliciously, way back in the early chapters. Hi, Ruthie. Here to see Mr. Swan? Ruthie nodded. She still didn't talk much, but Joanna knew her family cared for her and that she would eventually open up. Joanna lifted Ruthie up into her arms so she could have a better view of the incoming train. Joanna thought about all the things she would tell Mr. Swan. Johnny was walking now. Henry and Jeremy had built a new fence. She and Janie were learning how to make their own clothes from a seamstress in town. Joanna was working up the courage to ask the seamstress for an apprenticeship. Apprenticeship is another vocabulary word. She hoped Mr. Swan would be happy for her and proud of how far she had come. Joanna thought back to the girl she was a year ago and that first horrible month she lived here in Iowa. Back then, she prayed that this year would go fast and she would make Mr. Swan to take her different family. Now she loved her new life and almost hoped it would slow down so she could enjoy it all the more. She was shaken from her thoughts by the shrill sounds of the steam engine. Mr. Swan's train was pulling in. She smiled at Ruthie and gave her a big squeeze.